let's start with part 4 of this Gen AI Masterclass, which is where we're going to learn how to evaluate the outputs that the AI gives us. So let's start by selecting the right tool. So an important part of evaluating AI is to pick the right tool in the first place to actually that actually does what you need it to do. So there are thousands of Gen AI tools to choose from. There are literally thousands of them, but you should be discerning with which you decide to actually use. So really, when you're really first starting, you should start with more general tools like Microsoft Copilot or ChatGPT before trying any of the more specialized tools. However, we wouldn't recommend uploading any personal data or copyrighted information to any of the Gen AI tools right now. Now, I can't right now recommend any one particular tool over the other for doing any particular task, but what I will go through is some of those considerations you should make when deciding which tools to use. And a good way to think through what is an appropriate tool to use is to actually understand a little bit about the differences between the data that the models are trained on, what the AI models actually are, and what are the tools that sit on top of those models. So to start off with, we have training data. So this is the data that is actually used through the machine learning, through the deep learning processes to actually teach the AI how to do a particular thing. The training data is fed into foundation models. A foundation model is actually the AI model that has learnt through training how to do something. So that an example of that is the large language models, like we've looked at, like OpenAI's suite of GPT models, for example, and other Gen AI models that can do things like generate images or music or video. These are the actual foundation models that learn how to do a particular task through training. Sitting on top of the foundation models are the actual tools that you interact with. And so these are things like ChatGPT or Microsoft Copilot or Google Gemini, etc. All these different types of tools, they sit on top of our foundation model. And it's important to know this because some of these tools actually use the same models and actually share what kind of models they use. So for example, the creative mode of Copilot, of Microsoft Copilot that I demonstrated before, uses GPT-4, which is OpenAI's foundation model, which is the same foundation model that the paid version of ChatGPT uses. And the difference is that at the moment, using creative mode of Microsoft Copilot is actually free to use. Well, you have to pay OpenAI to access the paid version of ChatGPT to get GPT-4. And GPT-4 at the moment, really just at the moment that I'm presenting this masterclass, is the most powerful AI foundation model that can be used publicly for most use cases. Most AI models that are created compare themselves to how well they perform against GPT-4. And so if you're using a tool that uses GPT-4, you can be more likely to get higher quality results than if they're using something like GPT 3.5, which is a much lower quality in terms of the reliability of the output it creates. I don't need to go into that in too much detail, but it's just a useful thing to keep in mind. And that I would really recommend trying the more general tools rather than the specific ones, because in most cases, the general tools can do just about what you need, and then start exploring the more specific tools once you have a particular use case that you need. Now, I just really want to highlight that not everyone may realize is that Grammarly, which a lot of people use for checking grammar, is actually a Gen AI tool now. That as of 2023, Grammarly does actually use Gen AI to suggest how to restructure sentences. So when we're talking about these tips and tricks and considerations we need to make about whether we can use generative AI in a particular use case, Grammarly is one of those tools we also need to just think about. And if we're unsure about whether that is an appropriate use to use for a particular assignment, for example, you should really ask your course coordinator around what are the expectations around how AI can be used in that particular case. So just to re-emphasize before we look at how to evaluate AI output, we just need to re-emphasize that Gen AI doesn't know anything. Most Gen AI tools don't understand knowledge or store any kind of meaning about how language works. It just understands the structure of language really well, rather than what the words mean. And there is no intention or agency behind the words. So because of this, Gen AI can hallucinate. So hallucinations are when a Gen AI model states something incorrect or misleading. Like I said, most Gen AI doesn't actually know about the world, and so it can get things wrong. Sometimes hallucinations are obvious, particularly if you're using a tool that has maybe a slightly out of date AI model. Sometimes those hallucinations are just obviously wrong facts about the world. Like it might say the sky is green rather than blue. But the more advanced Gen AI models, like GPT-4, can be more subtle and convincing in the hallucinations that they have. Hallucinations occur because Gen AI doesn't really know anything about the world, as I said. So we must check everything Gen AI gives us. We must treat Gen AI as a useful but unreliable source of information that we need to fact check against more reliable sources of information out in the world. Just as you would interacting with any other kind of information source when creating assignments, when reading journal articles, reading books, looking at websites, reading government reports. This is a broader spectrum of information literacy, which if you would like to learn more about how to do that effectively, I would recommend looking into the library's self-paced courses like Library Essentials, or keep an eye out for other library workshops that we run around how to effectively evaluate and judge information and find information that's most likely to be reliable. So we shouldn't take anything that a Gen AI tool gives us and just use it and expect that it's true. We need to take it with a grain of salt and evaluate carefully before we actually use it. A key concept in the responsible use of AI is called the human in the loop. So as the human using an AI tool, you are always accountable and responsible for whatever the Gen AI creates. AI systems should always have a human in the loop who checks the AI's accuracy and is ultimately accountable for how the AI's output is used. So in the case of using a Gen AI tool, that person, that human in the loop is you. You are ultimately accountable and responsible for what you put into the AI and what the AI creates. Another way that Gen AI can go wrong that you need to evaluate when you're using AI is that Gen AI can be biased. Gen AI can generate biased or discriminatory output. So for example, some AI models, when you ask it to tell a story about a doctor, it will tend to use male pronouns rather than female pronouns, just as an example. And this is because that Gen AI is trained on data about the world, and it can be trained on data that is biased because it reflects the actual world, which is often biased and discriminatory in certain contexts. So that bias can come from bias in the underlying training data. It can come from how the AI model has been programmed, or in how you have worded your prompt. Perhaps there is some unseen bias in the prompt that you've created that has actually created a context for it to create a biased output. So again, you need to check everything that Gen AI gives you. Most tools, or the bigger tools, are trying to do something to improve this in terms of ways that it tweaks the prompts that you put in. So you might put in a prompt and it subtly changes what your prompt actually is in the back end to remove bias, or it does a few other clever things to try and do that. But this is a hard problem to solve, actually. And those of us who have seen some of the challenges that Google Gemini had in how it generated images, we can see that there's some challenges in trying to fix this problem. So in that case, Google Gemini was adding more diversity into the photos that it was generating, but in doing so, in a way of trying to address some of the problems in biased output, actually started to add diversity into photos that were supposed to be, or into generated images that were supposed to be representing historical situations, which were biased because it's meant to reflect reality. So there can be a tension between accurately reflecting reality and being accurate and eliminating bias and discriminatory output. So we just need to check that when we're creating things, look at it. Is what it's created biased or not? And Gen AI can also plagiarize. It's another thing we need to look at when evaluating AI. So in generating content, Gen AI can accidentally reproduce and plagiarize the work of real humans. Now, fundamentally, most of the Gen AI tools aren't really storing copies of the data it's trained in to draw from. So when you ask Gen AI tool you prompt it to create some text for you, it's not actually going and looking at copies of Charles Dickens's work, for example, to create the output. If you've asked it to create something in the style of Charles Dickens, it's drawing from its understanding of language, that structural understanding of language that we looked at earlier. However, in doing so, it can accidentally reproduce words, word for word, that have already existed elsewhere and are actually someone else's words. So we need to be careful of that and be conscious of that and check that what we've actually created isn't unintentionally plagiarizing somebody else's work. But there is a more fundamental challenge here, and that is that the AI models are trained on other people's work. In just a moment, we'll come to some of the ethical challenges of that. But this can be particularly problematic for AI-generated images and video, which if you've asked it to generate an image in the style of another artist, you can unintentionally or to actually plagiarize the work of somebody else. And so we need to be careful of that before using that information or using those images that we create. And finally, Gen AI writing can be vague. And so a large language model's output is almost like the average of the data on which it is trained. It's almost like it's trying to guess what is the most average, statistically likely result that it can create, which can make its writing vague and lack linguistic diversity. So that means that it can lack a diversity in the types of words that it uses that you would normally find in human writing. And this might become a bigger problem over time. There is some research that shows that Gen AI models trained on the Gen AI output degrades in quality over time as the work that it creates becomes more and more vague without human input into it. So that, again, that's something just to be aware of, that what Gen AI creates can be useful, but can also be somewhat vague and wishy-washy, that requires some human intervention to actually be more useful. One way to make Gen AI's writing less vague and make its output more specific is to add more context and specific detail to your prompts. The more detail and specific context that you provide, the more likely it will be to create less vague writing. And so the more that you already know about a topic, the better you will be at making Gen AI's writing more specific.